We are here today to talk through the Ursula SAR, which was endorsed by the West of Berkshire Board in January 2025. I'm Rebecca Berry, Head of Safeguarding and Quality Assurance at Wokingham. I'm in here today with
Lynne Mason. I'm the Business Manager for the West of Berkshire Safeguarding Adults Board.
So we just wanted to give a brief overview of Ursula SAR. There is the full report can be found on the website, which is where you'd be able to get a lot more detail. But we just wanted to go through some areas to point out parts that people will find interesting. So for the Ursula SAR, we decided that we wanted to approach things a little bit differently. Rather than being led by a paper exercise where we looked at recording and we approached it from thinking about from the professional's lens, we wanted to understand more from those people that knew Ursula, from her family member and her neighbour. So we wanted the SAR to be led by people with lived experience. And within that as well, we wanted to find out from the professionals working in the system and some of those who'd worked with Ursula, find out what it was like working in the system and what would make a difference, what could be changed within the system. So as a result of that, an event was held with a family member, Ursula's neighbour, and professionals, and everybody got together and thoughts and feedback was sought from attending professionals after the event. So it was a really powerful event where Ursula's family and neighbour spoke very passionately about her and about what they felt would make a difference. So who was Ursula? Ursula lived alone in a privately owned detached property. She was in her early 70s. Her property was heavily hoarded, with items preventing her from using or accessing most of the areas of her home. There were also items, including food, being collected and stored in a car in her driveway. She was reported by professionals to be a very private person who had very limited contact with most of her neighbours, who said she was rarely seen, more often at night if she was seen. In August 2022, concerns were raised from the antisocial behaviour team to adult social care, that there'd been an extended period where multiple organisations, including police, health, adult social care and the fire service, everybody made attempts to engage and make contact with Ursula. But despite multiple agencies being involved, that was with limited success. Sometimes she answered text messages, sometimes spoke through the door. No professionals were able to gain access. And in December 2023, she was sadly found deceased inside her property, which then led to us looking at a SAR. So as I just said, there were multiple agencies involved with Ursula. There were police, adult social care, GP, fire service. Wicken is something Wokingham specific. It's the Wokingham Integrated Care Network, which is for primary health GPs and having contact with social care. So it's sharing information about certain people where there are concerns around health and social care. The antisocial behaviour team were involved, environmental health, and the community mental health team. So there were multiple agencies involved working with Ursula. But I think what was most important in this safeguarding adult review was getting family member and neighbour perspective. And as you'll be able to see in the full report, the feedback from professionals was that they found that invaluable. They found that really useful to hear what the family and neighbour had to say. What came across really powerfully from Ursula's family and neighbour, and what they wanted us to know as a group of professionals, was that she was loved and that she had a family who she was really close to. And I think often there can be a perception that somebody who's living with hoarding behaviour, where there's elements of self-neglect, that those people are isolated and they've got no one around them. And what we learnt, Lynne, wasn't it, that she was having lots of contact with family.
She was, yeah, and it got the impression that she tried to keep them at arm's length, particularly from her property. They just had no idea about this hoarding behaviour at all. I think they felt that Ursula was a bit of a hoarder, but didn't realise it had got to the extent that it had done. Until they actually gained access to the property, sadly, after Ursula had died.
And what I thought was really interesting was that Ursula had lots of interactions with her neighbour, who was very supportive, but very boundaried. What we heard was that she was very clear when she first met the neighbour. I won't be accepting help. I have difficulty accepting help. And it took something like 10 years before she shared her phone number with her neighbour. And her neighbour wasn't aware that family were involved, and family weren't aware that neighbours were involved. And what came across loud and clear is Ursula was an incredibly intelligent woman. She was incredibly articulate, very successful in her career, and was able to compartmentalise and make sure that people didn't know about their each involvement in her life. Also, that she was able to sort of keep professionals at bay, but there were consequences for family members. If a family member overstepped the mark in making overtures to try to provide support or making comment about how she was living, Ursula would cease contact with that family member. So the family member still involved was walking a tightrope, really, of trying to support, but being aware that overstepping a mark could result in that relationship being ceased. I said, well, she didn't throw anything away for 20 years. So at what point does something flag to say there is somebody living here and they haven't thrown anything away for 20 years? So Ursula's family were quite clear that actually by the time professionals were involved, things were so entrenched that actually intervention wasn't going to be successful. But actually it's catching people at the early stages, understanding what the underlying issues are around that cause hoarding behaviour. And they felt that there was a lack of support for the loved ones or the friends or neighbours of somebody with hoarding behaviour, that was support that would be really useful.
Yeah, they felt like they didn't know where to go with it. They didn't realise that there was opportunities for us to support them with that, I think, and that came out quite strongly, I think, from both the family member and Ursula's neighbour. They didn't know where to go, and they didn't want to overstep.
It was that to take legal action to clear the house or removed her would have killed her. That was their, the words. Her neighbour said, what can be done to support people living near those that have hoarding behaviour, and treating the root cause. Someone doesn't know that they have a problem till it's gone too far. And the observation was that it was a cruel illness, but recognising that actually there is a root cause there was what they were talking to us about.
And I think affluence played a part in this as well, didn't it? So Ursula could communicate when she wanted to or needed to, and as we mentioned before, was very clear to keep everyone quite compartmentalized. So the neighbour didn't know that Ursula had family, professionals didn't know that Ursula had a loving family, and that actually led to a delay in Ursula's family being informed of her passing away, which was incredibly upsetting for her family. And also it was a detached property with grounds, so the issues that sort of would impact neighbours wouldn't have necessarily come to a light as soon as they would have done maybe if it was in a terraced house, for example, or a rented house. So I think that sort of allowed the situation maybe to escalate more than it maybe could have done or been identified by professionals sooner.
Absolutely. And if somebody is living in rented accommodation or in social housing, there are levers through the court for the landlord to gain access, for properties to be in a certain condition. But if somebody owns their own property, and as you said, Lynn, are not attached to anyone, that removes a certain amount of levers within a legal framework. I think this is really lovely to hear that, you know, I think this is Ursula's neighbour. I found professionals kind and concerned, felt their frustration at Ursula's unwillingness to even speak to them. Particularly Ursula's niece mentioned how supportive, sensitive and helpful the police were in their contact with her after she died. And again, we've already mentioned this, but there was no idea amongst her family and her neighbour, and they reflected, you know, maybe we could have joined forces, but Ursula was effective in keeping people apart. I mean, in fact, both parties knew her as a different name.
Yeah.
So they told us, you know, we asked Ursula's family and her neighbour what could make a difference. And thinking back to what we've already said about how families are walking a tightrope, knowing where to get support without breaking that trust, without losing that relationship completely. Bereavement support after somebody has died, support for the family even after a loved one's death. And included in that would be information and guidance from environmental health. How do families, and this came across really powerfully, how do families who are then faced with a property where somebody has hoarded belongings for 20, 30 years, and then they are faced with a privately owned property which is full of items, plus, you know, potentially hazardous substances, etc. What support can they have? And the family commented that, you know, if you've travelled into the area, that you may not actually get, because there's restricted access to recycling centres. Those were things that they said would make a difference to them. So looking at the sort of professional practice that was looked at in the SAR, it was for Section 11(2)(b) of the Care Act. Section 11 tells us that if somebody wishes to decline an assessment of needs under Section 9 of the Care Act, Section 11 gives people the ability to say, no, thank you very much, local authority, I don't want an assessment of my needs. And Section 11 gives two circumstances where that ability to say, no, thank you very much and decline that assessment, when that ability is removed from someone. And Section 11(2)(a) talks about if somebody lacks mental capacity to make the decision to refuse the assessment and it would be in their best interest to do so, then an assessment should be completed anyway. And the second part of that, 2(b), is that if there's a concern that somebody is experiencing or at risk of abuse or neglect, then that ability to refuse that assessment is removed. And the categories of abuse in the Care Act, self-neglect is one of those. And whilst we may have some leeway under Section 42 as to whether we undertake a safeguarding inquiry for self-neglect, there is no such leeway in Section 11(2)(b). So if there's a concern about self-neglect and somebody is declining that assessment, Section 11(2)(b) kicks in so that we do the assessment regardless of whether somebody wants that. And that's been a feature in some previous SARs that we've had in West of Berkshire, Sandra and Tina, if you wanted to have a look at the website for those. So what we saw for Ursula was that the assessment had been completed because of 11(2)(b). But what I was able to see was that it was the what's next then. So when you establish, the assessment is to establish somebody's needs. The Care Act tells us that we have to share that in writing with somebody. These are your needs. This is how we're proposing to meet them. And then obviously people can decide not to accept those services. But it's following up on, we do the assessment, what do we do next? And then the communication between agencies to work out how to meet those needs. and communication between agencies in the right way. Which multi-agency pathways are we using? Are we getting the right people together to allow us to recognise escalating risk? Because a lot of work with self-neglect is relationship based. People that are working with those that have hoarding behaviour are self-neglecting. We'll try to establish a rapport, we'll try to establish a relationship. So therefore, sometimes over a period of time, because that person is perhaps answering your calls sometimes or letting you speak to them through the door, it can give a sense of something progressing and actually that the risk is being managed, when in fact that relationship is not, that's having no impact on the level of risk. So when we were looking at the intervention of agencies, it was thinking about, are we recognising that risk is escalating, and actually, despite the efforts to build a relationship, that we're not impacting the level of risk?
And we felt in this Safeguarding Adult review that legal advice should have been initiated a bit earlier. What we did learn from Ursula is that from the Tina and Sandra SAR, Section 11 2B hadn't been even considered or initiated. So we've definitely made progress as a system. And we certainly did see improvements around Mental Capacity Act and considering that was considered with Ursula across a number of different professionals and organisations. But I think it's that, again, looking at that executive capacity, it was clear from what we learned about Ursula that she knew to sort of talk the talk, but not necessarily walk the walk. I think her family member mentioned that she'd said, "Oh, I'm going to get a new kitchen," or it might have been a bathroom, and she'd bought all of the stuff, and that was found in the property. Whilst she had the capacity to say, "I'm going to get a bathroom and buy a bathroom." It would never have been possible with the way the property was hoarded for that bathroom to have been put in.
Because her decisional capacity was there, wasn't it? She had, her intention was to do this sink, the kitchen and bathroom, but it was that ability to put those decisions into action. And you mentioned it already, Lynne, about the impact of affluence and eloquence, that somebody with incredibly high intelligence is able to verbalise why social workers and police and every other person that ends up at somebody's door need to go away, and telling them the consequences if they don't. And so sometimes as professionals, we need to wonder about that bias, think about that. Are we more likely to be sent on our way by somebody who's able, in a very forthright manner, to tell us exactly the legal powers or the legal support they have in order to tell us to go away? And does that impact how we respond to people? Also, if one tack to engage someone is not working, do we sometimes keep on trying and think at some point that person will answer the phone? Or do we need to sometimes think about, well, this isn't working, what other routes? Is it text messages? Is it visits? Is it somebody trusted within the network? Or is there any professional in the network who this person has any engagement with? And that takes us back to what the family was saying about treatment pathways. What's the root cause? As a partnership, how well are those understood? And I think those have fed into our recommendations as we get towards the recommendation part. We also we reflected at the Safeguarding Adult Review Panel. It was acknowledged that this isn't a standalone situation. Across the 3 local authorities, across the partnership that are part of the West of Berkshire Board, it was that these are prevalent across the West of Berkshire, and that a similar situation could happen again. So reading the full report, you'll be able to see the reflections of professionals that that participated in the learning review, but particularly these 4 areas came out as training needs identified by professionals, that self-neglect and hoarding behaviour, understanding the root causes and effective interventions, what works. We've already highlighted mental capacity, executive capacity and self-neglect and hoarding behaviour, understanding the relationship between those and supporting people to make an assessment of those, because it's a very tricky area. Framework, Lynne and I have already mentioned about when to recognise escalating risk and that interventions are not mitigating that risk. At what point do we need to think about the legal framework and seeking legal advice, and sometimes going to court, and some training, some reflection on the impact of affluence and eloquence on intervention.
Just wanted to say as well about the legal framework and legal advice. I think most people that are watching this video will be working for an organisation that does have legal teams. They are there to support you. They are a supportive function. So ask for that advice.
Absolutely. So that brought us on to our recommendations. And they've sort of fallen into 2 areas, haven't they? So we had one which was around sort of communication and awareness. And this was about public, because loud and clear, Ursula's neighbour and her family were telling us that actually for those people who are in that person's life, services will get to know about somebody way down the line, whereas actually family members, neighbours and friends may start to notice that somebody may need support much earlier. So it's about that information being publicly available, about it being destigmatised, and where people can get community support. So it's looking at how we can pull together those resources so that people within the community know how to support each other. And the board to produce information to provide to people with hoarding behaviour, which explains the legal duties of the local authorities and others, including when those organisations have to be involved and how to work with them. And you mentioned that earlier, Lynne. That's about empowering people to be aware, because somebody may think, if I just don't engage with the local authority, they will go away, because there's a lack of understanding or transparency around when certain legal duties apply, and when local authorities and other professionals are unable to just walk away, and so it's giving people that information and then knowing where to get support, and particularly working with stakeholders to produce information for families around specific bereavement support after someone dies related to self-neglect and hoarding. And our recommendation that entirely comes from a family member is this feedback being shared with those that are involved in refuse collection, so that can be an early indicator that there may be an issue with hoarding behaviour. The other set of our recommendations were regarding practice. So seeking for agencies to review their existing hoarding protocol, whether any amendments are needed based on reflections from this SAR, protocols to include guidance on recognising escalating risk, when the risk may not be changing, when to seek legal advice and how. Working together to establish hoarding pathways and more in-depth understanding of the root causes of hoarding behaviour. And again, that's coming from what family and Ursula's neighbour fed back to us were the most important things for them. We considered reviewing the use of existing multi-agency risk management forums for hoarding and self-neglect. There are already these pathways in place. We have safeguarding strategy meetings, case conferences, multi-agency risk management conferences, and best interest meetings. And there were conversations within the professional network about whether we needed a new pathway or a new set of meetings, weren't there, Lynne? And then actually we thought, we've got these things in place. how can we use them better for hoarding and self-neglect behaviour? Whether we need to explore commissioning of specialist providers to work with people with hoarding behaviour. As Lynne said, it can be a lot of time. It's relationship based, and so when we're commissioning services to work with people, are we making sure that those people have the skills, the knowledge, and the time? And against the training needs that we've already talked about, reviewing all agencies to review their training plans against those that are identified to assure the board that people have access to that information.
So we just wanted to say thank you to everyone, and thank you to Rebecca for stepping up and being the author of this Safeguarding Adult Review. It was refreshing to have such a different approach to this Safeguarding Adult Review, and that couldn't have happened without Ursula's family member and neighbour kindly agreeing to give up their time to share their experiences with us so thoughtfully as well. It was like I say, we learned a lot at that event, and we hope that we've done a good job at presenting that within this presentation, but also with the written report we've got and the recommendations that have come out of it. So yeah, we hope that that's been it's going to be worth it, and I think we are confident that it will be. It's raising that awareness. As you can see here, there's some information, further information, so links to the actual full SAR report and other Safeguarding Adult Reviews that we've touched on, and guidance documents that we ask you to take a look at when you can, but also there's loads of resources on our board website, so please do take the time to go along. And if you want any if you have any feedback about this Safeguarding Adult Review or anything else that you've looked at, please contact me directly. My email address is there as well, and we can take that into account. But yeah, just wanted to say thank you to everyone that was involved.
Well, thank you, Lynne, and thank you to Lynne and the board for supporting a co-production approach with this Safeguarding Adult Review.